Now, welcome. As I've indicated, my name is Chene Ward, and I will be doing a research presentation titled The Relationship Between Psychological Capital and Psychological Well-Being Among Students at a Previously Disadvantaged South African University. We know that research indicates that there's a high level of academic stress amongst our students as our students integrate from high school moving into university life. The demands become quite different. There's academic demands, there's family demands, there's social demands, and the integration of all of them can be quite a stressful journey to actually figure out. This can often result into psychological ill health such as depression, anxiety, behavioral problems, and even irritability. Now, in order to respond and curb such psychological ill health, this study is indicating that psychological well-being needs to be introduced amongst our students, it needs to be developed, and it needs to be retained to ensure a strong psychological state of our students within university. This is especially important since our students often become the future of our society, of our families, and of our country. These individuals symbolize the future workforce. They will move into organizations once they move into the labor market and exit the higher education sector. They would actually contribute to the overall economic growth and development of our country. Now, alarming research has indicated that there's a sense of lowered psychological well-being amongst our students. A study has indicated that 1 out of 4 university students have been experiencing poor mental state and lowered psychological well-being. This is especially alarming since its positive outcomes of psychological well-being is so dire to an individual within the university. Psychological well-being is known to be positively associated with things like academic achievement, emotional intelligence, and resilience. Their psychological well-being therefore needs to be considered even before they move into the labor market. This study is suggesting that we use psychological capital as a combination of personal resources to curb this lowered psychological well-being amongst our students, which is the main aim of this specific study. The main objective of the study is to investigate whether or not if there is a relationship between psychological capital and psychological well-being. It's also supported by sub-objectives, one being to see if there's a relationship between the dimensions of psychological capital and psychological well-being, and then to look at overall if there is a relationship between the overall construct of psychological capital and the overall construct of psychological well-being. Literature around psychological well-being suggesting that the current reality of our university students is that they're really experiencing psychological problems. This is alarming, and that the severity thereof is on the rise. The call, therefore, to understand psychological well-being and its impact on our university students have been actually answered by the international community of scholars. However, it has been largely ignored by our South African scholars at large. When we consider what we mean with psychological well-being, we adopt a definition by RIF 1989 of psychological well-being as indicating to be an overall positive state of mental health. It encompasses a variety of psychological features, and it allows an individual to function well. It's very complex and multidimensional in nature, consisting out of different dimensions, namely self-acceptance, environmental mastery, personal growth, autonomy, healthy relationships, and purpose in life. When we look at the definition for self-acceptance, it is a positive attitude towards yourself and acknowledges all the different selves that you have, including the bad and the good, and actually feels positive about what has happened in your past life. Environmental mastery speaks to one's confidence in the perceived capability of managing responsibilities of life. High levels of environmental mastery in individuals indicate that they have a sense of competence in managing the environment, having a control over complex external activities, and the effective use of surrounding opportunities, and the ability to choose or create context suitable to their personal needs and values. To have lowered levels of environmental mastery really indicates that you struggle to manage day-to-day stuff, everyday affairs. You have the inability to change or even improve your environment, and you're totally unaware of the surrounding opportunities that surround you. The individual then essentially lacks a sense of control over the external world. The psychological well-being, looking at the psychological well-being dimension, positive relations with others, really refers to whether one has and can form warm and trusting relationship with others. When you score low on this dimension, you struggle to trust others. You're quite skeptical of relationships, and you find it difficult to be warm and open towards others. You often isolate yourself, and you are often frustrated in interpersonal relationships, and you're not willing to make compromises to even sustain or keep important bonds or ties with others. Personal growth is the ability to develop and expand the self, to become a fully functioning person, and to accomplish your goals and essentially self-actualize. Higher levels of personal growth is associated with continued development, while lowered levels of personal growth is suggestive of a lack of growth, and you really have a sense of personal stagnation when you score lower. These individuals feel bored and often uninterested with life. They feel they are unable to change their behaviors or even their attitudes. Purpose in life refers to an individual's sense of life that has meaning and direction. Individuals that score low on this dimension have a sense of directedness, and they have certain goals in life. They have aims and objectives, and they live for that. Autonomy is the regulation of one's own individual behavior through the internal locus of control. Autonomous individuals do not seek out the combination from other individuals. They are not focused on other people's perspectives, evaluations, or even judgment. They are less persuaded by the social pressures of life and is often known to be independent. They act in a certain way, and this is often based on personal standards. When you score lower on autonomy, it's often that you are expected and you are concerned about the expectations and evaluations of others. You rely on the judgment of others, and you conform to social pressures to even make important decisions. And in summary, those 6 dimensions encompasses what we know to be psychological well-being. Psychological well-being among students have been found to have different outcomes. When we consider psychological well-being and academic performance and academic achievement, there's a positive relationship there. So ultimately, higher levels of psychological well-being is good for your overall academic performance. Further evidence suggests that psychological well-being is positively associated with emotional intelligence, which allows students to really regulate often negative emotions as they experience university life. It's also associated positively with resilience. So these individuals, when they have higher levels of psychological well-being, they often can grasp the notion to bounce back quickly from the setbacks and the challenges that life throws at them. It's associated with overall improved physical health, and it's often overlooked when we just focus on the academic aspect of a university student. Perceived self-esteem and learning goal orientation is also positively associated with psychological well-being. This includes happiness and being creative. Now, psychological well-being is known to be negatively associated with depression. So the higher your levels of psychological well-being, the less likely it is that an individual, specifically a student, would fall into the cycle of depression. However, when there's lowered level of psychological well-being, it really can foster a real significant psychological damage amongst our students. Research suggests that students who have lowered levels of psychological well-being are more prone to depression, anxiety, and even suicidal thoughts and ideation. Now, research around psychological well-being has mainly really just focused on the psychological health field, and its application is quite limited to the industrial and organizational psychology field. Now, even when we consider its applicability within the higher education sector, it's really limited as well. Therefore, this study has really answered the call to address this gap in literature. Now, the other variable that the study is focusing on is psychological capital. Now, we know that psychological capital is derived from the movement, the positive psychology movement, and the positive organizational behavior movement, which has realized the need to move away from the negative approach to an individual's strengths. We need to rather focus on individual strengths of people and their positive qualities. So psychological capital is actually psychological states, as opposed to, for example, fixed traits, and it's therefore open to development through things like role modeling, social persuasion, and even mastery or performance attainments. There's four main constructs within this psychological capital construct, being self-efficacy, optimism, resilience, and hope. Now, self-efficacy, like the other constructs, is quite important for psychological well-being, for psychological capital, sorry. It refers to an individual's confidence in their ability to really control outcomes and overcome even difficult challenges. So individuals with high levels of self-efficacy believe they are in control of what happens to them. These people know that they can beat any challenge that comes their way. These individuals don't shy away from tough goals, and they are often motivated to actually accomplish them and achieve them. They aren't discouraged by failure and believe they have a control to fix this. Put simply, individuals with high level of self-confidence really believe in themselves. Optimism is a word that we often generally use within everyday language. And in research, it means an individual's expectation of a positive outcome in the end. Simply, individuals with high levels of optimism believe actually things will work out in the end and things are going to end well. Optimistic people are motivated to deal with issues right away. Similar to self-efficacy, optimistic individuals believe things will go well, even in the midst of trials and tribulations. They believe that things will be okay in the end. Hope is another word that we often use in everyday language. And in research, we look at it as being made out of two aspects, one being an agency and one being a pathway. The agency would be considered to be the motivation to want to succeed in a specific goal or task, while the pathways is the way in which we want to accomplish that specific task or goal. People with high levels of hope find alternative ways. They redirect their path to meet specific goals and to accomplish them and reach for success. In other words, high hopers are individuals that score high in hope. They work hard to reach their goals and will adjust if necessary if something doesn't go to plan or if something doesn't work. Now, finally, the last resource of psychological capital is resilience. Now, resilience is known to be able to actually bounce back from life's adversities and life's challenges, failures, and setbacks, which is often a really difficult task to do, especially when you score really low on this construct. Resilient people can adapt to change and stressful situations quite effectively. They're good at working through negative experiences and changes that's happening around them. So they're quite flexible. Most people would identify these people as being strong after seeing them really come back from a really difficult situation. Now, despite the growing international and local attention Psychological has received for its outcome and positive outcomes and negative outcomes for work-related consequences, its consequences within the higher education industry, specifically within the South African context, has really received little consideration from South African scholars, which this research study has actually aimed to address. Within the psychological capital literature, when we consider the student population, psychological capital has been found to positively impact things like satisfaction, academic adjustment, study engagement, intrinsic motivation, academic performance, and even entrepreneurial intention. Higher levels of psychological capital is often negatively associated with lowered levels of stress, which indicates that when our students, for example, would have higher levels of psychological capital, they would have better resources to actually deal with stress and, in essence, lower stress amongst themselves. When we consider the specific dimensions of psychological capital, starting off with hope, studies do support a relationship between hope and psychological well-being across different population studies. This includes students as well. Optimism, yes, there is found to be a relationship between psychological well-being and optimism as well in different studies. When we consider resilience, a study has been found to show a relationship between psychological well-being and resilience as well. And self-efficacy has shown to have a significant relationship between self-efficacy and psychological well-being for different populations as well. Now, when we look at the relationship between psychological capital and psychological well-being, international employee samples in studies provide evidence. There's a lot of evidence in support of this relationship between psychological well-being and psychological capital. However, within the South African context, it's still a bit limited as well when we consider this relationship within employee samples. While international research indicates and it exists that there is a relationship between psychological capital and psychological well-being amongst our students, its applicability within the South African context, given our history, given our current state of affairs, really remains quite and extremely limited. Therefore, limited, if any, studies among the South African university students exist that focuses specifically on the relationship between psychological capital and psychological well-being, which the study aimed to address. Now, evidence suggests when we consider the different constructs of psychological capital, being hope, self-efficacy, resilience, and optimism, it's shown to have a relationship with psychological well-being. So each construct there is evidence for each construct to have a relationship with psychological well-being. Now, the research methodology for the study and how the study was carried out was that it took a quantitative approach. This approach was best suited to actually achieve the objectives and actually answer the hypothesis of the overall study. Questionnaires was administered to the students, being 141 students, male and female students, using a non-probability convenience sampling technique. This was the most appropriate sampling technique given this current situation, time constraints and financial constraints the researcher actually experienced while carrying out this specific research. With regards to convenience sampling, it referred to the proximity and the immediate availability of this student group to the researcher. Questionnaires were divided into 3 sections, one being the demographic section, 2 being the psychological capital questionnaire, 3 being the flourishing questionnaire. Now, various studies have confirmed the reliability and validity across different population groups when we look at the reliability and validity of the psychological capital questionnaire and the flourishing questionnaire as well. These were the most appropriate scales or measurements to use to measure psychological capital and psychological well-being as well. These questionnaires were hand-delivered to students. It was handed out, and students were asked to return the questionnaires within 3 working days. Those questionnaires were then sorted and looked at which ones were complete, which ones were incomplete, and which ones could not be used for data analysis. Overall, 141 male and female students completed the questionnaires. Now, in order to analyze data, descriptive statistics and inferential statistics was used. Descriptive statistics mainly focused on describing the demographics of the specific data. The inferential statistics that was used here was considered to be the Pearson product moment correlation to look at whether or not there is relationships between the different dimensions of psychological capital and psychological well-being, and the overall psychological capital and the overall psychological well-being. Ethical considerations was weighed when the study was done. Ethical clearance was received from the specific university ethical clearance committee, ethical clearance research committee. Once ethical clearance was received, data collection commenced. All individuals were informed of the specific study, of the purpose of the study, and given all the necessary information. They also were indicated that this was voluntary participation, so no one was forced to actually participate in the study at all. Anonymity was guaranteed as questionnaires was handed back without their names, without any student numbers on the questionnaires. Furthermore, confidentiality was ensured to make sure that there's a limited number of individuals that had access to the data. It was stored in a protected, locked cabinet and made sure that no one else has access to that specific cabinet. Now, when we look at the specific results, there is a significant relationship between psychological capital and psychological well-being. Furthermore, interesting enough, there is no significant relationship between the construct self-efficacy and psychological well-being amongst the student group. There is found to be a relationship between optimism and psychological well-being, as well as hope and resilience as well. Now, when we look at discussing these results, like I said, there is a positive, significant relationship between psychological capital and psychological well-being amongst these students at a previously disadvantaged university. And it's appearing to be in line with other results from other studies. When we consider the dimensions of psychological capital and psychological well-being, there's only a significant relationship between hope, optimism, resilience, and psychological well-being. There is no relationship between self-efficacy and psychological well-being for this specific study group. Now, when we consider optimism as one of the constructs for psychological capital, individuals or students specifically who are more optimistic or have an optimistic outlook on life often experience reduced depressive symptoms and stress, which may impact and enhance their psychological well-being and enhance their self-esteem, developing and sustaining even relationships, and favoring adjustment to university life. Research has been done to say that enhancing psychological well-being through practicing optimistic thinking by visualizing the best future selves has really yielded positive results within various studies. When we consider hope as another construct of psychological capital, when we see that hope, and the definition of hope is that you work towards specific objectives and you redirect your paths to see where you can get the best outcome. It becomes extremely and considerably important to university students who often have to meet specific goals and achieve those goals, especially when we consider their academic achievement excellence, and thus doing so without any psychological hindrances. The present study therefore suggests that when individuals have higher levels of hope, their psychological well-being may be high as well, may lead to less psychological problems. This is also in line with other findings from other studies. When we consider resilience, the other construct of psychological capital, university students' resilience can therefore enhance their psychological well-being when they have to cope with life's adversities and when life throws challenges at them. Resilient people can identify obviously the positive aspects of things even during adversities, and that often regulates that negative emotion. Such adaptive emotion regulation is often associated with improved well-being. Now, interestingly, self-efficacy is known within the study not to be significantly positively related to psychological well-being, which is in contrast to other studies. And this is extremely interesting, as self-efficacy is often associated with the confidence in your ability to be able to actually achieve at the end of the day. Now, recommendations for future research. Now, for this specific study and from this specific study, future research can really adopt another quantitative approach to see if there is association between psychological capital and psychological well-being amongst different sectors, as this might have different results or different implications. Future research is also encouraged to really look at using a qualitative research approach in a way to get an in-depth understanding as to why there is a relationship between these two concepts amongst this student group, especially given that it's such a westernized concept. Furthermore, future research can also explore reasons why only those specific subskills, being optimism, hope, and resilience, is only associated with psychological well-being and not self-efficacy. Future research might also want to consider using a qualitative approach to really understand the views of a South African sample on psychological capital and even psychological well-being and all of its subscales to test its alignment to such westernized concepts. The practical implications of the study is that this study really supports and stresses the importance of really improving the psychological capital of our students as a means to increase lowered psychological well-being. This is really important in order to enhance mental health of our university students, as they're often exposed to a variety of stresses. While it's still expected by their peers, family, and university staff to still excel in their academics. It appears that institutions of higher learning, in collaboration with organizations, therefore need to implement different programs and even workshops to strengthen their students' psychological capital and enable greater psychological well-being. This is especially important as students won't be staying within higher education sector or higher education institutions forever. They will move into the labor market at some stage, and you want psychologically strong employees to move into those organizations. Now, no study is without its limitations. Must know that the study or the sample was drawn from universities at a previously disadvantaged university, specifically within the Eastern Cape. So care needs to be taken when you interpret the results and the conclusion to different occupational groups. A small sample size was obtained for the study, and that could be due to the fact that while the study was in the process of data collection, it was an examination period. It could therefore have actually influenced the number of responses received for the study. Time constraints and limited financial constraints were also considered to be limitations of the study. I therefore thank you, and I really thank you for listening to this presentation. And really, when we consider the mental health of our university students, it goes without saying that it is important And it is important to explore different resources that is available to professionals, to organizations, to higher education sectors and institutions to implement the necessary changes in order to protect our students and ensure that we set them up for success as they move out of the higher education sector. Here are my contact details if you have more questions or if you would like to engage on specific areas of results or discussion on this topic a bit more further. Thank you so much, and I really appreciate you listening to this presentation.